Okay, so now that we've defined our user functions, we need to create a new file which is going to define our album functions. There's slightly more function definitions in here. However, create a PHP file and save this as album.func.php, and we can go ahead and define the functions that we use to handle albums. So the first function is album_data. Now this works extremely similarly to the user data function, in which case we are feeding in an unlimited amount of fields that we get from a specific album. Now the only difference is we need to give one parameter here, which is album ID. Now the rest of the functions here we don't predefine, because we again use the funcGetArgs function in PHP to determine how many functions have been passed to this album data function, and we can grab fields from there. However, if you're not too sure about this, don't worry about if you don't understand just yet. Later on, when we write the code inside, you'll understand a bit better how it works. Now the next function is called album_check, and this function also feeds in an album ID. So what we need to do is create the parameter there. This album check function will actually check if an album belongs to a particular user. Now this is extremely important because we're going to be using get variables on the end of the URL to specify which album we want to view. Now, for example, if a user had an album which had an ID of 1 in the database, and another user had an album with album ID of 2, we obviously don't want the second user to access the first user's album. So we need to include this function on the page to ensure that the users can't view each other's albums. We also have a function called getAlbums, which is going to be a pretty large function, but quite simple, because all we're doing here is we're grabbing a list of albums that belong to the user. So this is just going to return an array of albums that belong to the currently logged in user, and then we can display them albums in a list as you've seen. The next function is function createAlbum. This sort of speaks for itself. We're just going to feed in an album name, so album name, and an album description, spell that correctly, and this function's essentially just going to create an album for the currently logged in user using an album name and an album description, and that data is going to be inserted into the database. The next function is editAlbum. Essentially all this is going to do is it's firstly going to take an album ID, so we're going to reference or refer to this the current album that we want to edit using its album ID. We also then need album name and album description. Now album name and album description in this case are just the name and description that we want to change to. So we specify an album ID, for example album ID of 1, and we include a new name and a new description, and that just updates the database. The next function on the last function is deleteAlbum, and what this obviously does by the name is deletes a specific album, and again we take in album ID. Now this function is also going to take into account deleting users' albums that don't belong to them. So for example, we need to check that the album also belongs to the user, and we're going to be doing this in the query as well. So in the query when we perform it against the database. So we only want to delete an album that actually belongs to a specific user. So we're going to feed in just an album ID, and then that's simply going to remove that from the database, and that won't be displayed on the user's page anymore. Now what this will also do is delete all images within that album as well, and this is quite important because obviously if a user was to upload some images into an album, then wanted to delete the album, we also want to delete the files as well. Presumably the user doesn't actually want them images anymore, and therefore would be a waste of server space. So these are the album function definitions that we're going to be using within this project. Obviously again, make sure you save it as album.func.php and make sure it's located within the func folder.